Welcome to the Queens of Moxie. I'm Mary Kay Campbell, the host of this program, and I'm so excited that you've decided to join us today. Every week, we bring amazing women to our podcast to talk about how they have stepped into joy and reclaimed their moxie and are living their authentic life. I want to get started, but before we do, I want to remind you to subscribe to the weekly email. Simply go to queensofmoxie.com and click on Weekly Inspiration. That way, every Monday morning, you'll get a link to the latest podcast, a beautiful image, and a fabulous quote. It's a great way to start out your week. So let's get started with today's podcast. Hi, welcome to Queens of Moxie. Today I'm going to do something a little bit different. Because it is National Traumatic Brain Injury Awareness Month, I thought I would talk a little bit about what a TBI is, what the symptoms are, and for me, what I've learned from it and also where I am now, and hopefully provide some hope. So I wanted to give you some statistics and some general information. The CDC and many other places define a traumatic brain injury as a forceful bump, blow, or jolt to the head or body, or from an object that pierces the skull and enters the brain. In other words, your brain either gets jostled around or something penetrates your skull. Just so you know, there were more than 64,000 TBI-related deaths in the United States in 2020, and that's about 176 TBI-related deaths every day. So it's actually more common than you might realize. TBIs contribute to about 30% of all injury deaths. What's surprising to me is that falls are the number one cause of TBIs. And that's again from the CDC. And it's often among young children and those 65 and older. And I think about the time when my son was in elementary school. It had rained and the garage door was open afterwards and it was slick by the entrance of the garage door. And he slipped and fell and hit his head really hard. And of course, I was concerned about a concussion. He didn't have one, but you can see how falls very easily lead to concussions and traumatic brain injuries. You can also think about senior citizens who maybe are not as stable on their feet. They fall and in the process hit their head. So that's the number one cause of TBIs. The next is blunt trauma accidents, and that involves being struck against an object or with an object, particularly sports-related injuries. The third, which is what I had, was a vehicle-related injury. Assaults and violence are the fourth, and explosions and blasts are the last. Some of the things about TBIs, there's penetrating and non-penetrating, which obviously is if it enters your skull or not. It can have temporary and short-term problems, as well as long-term and permanent disability, as well as even death. It also can take weeks, hours, days to appear. So it just depends on the severity of the injury. And there are some chemicals that get released that can cause secondary problems as well. There are multiple kinds of TBIs. There's one where it happens over and over again, and when that happens, they actually have worse outcomes than if it's one big blow. But one big blow like I had can actually lead to dementia and other cognitive problems later in life. What we all hear about are concussions. Those are the mild kinds of TBI, and they're usually temporary, but it could take several minutes or months to heal. There's also hematomas, which is bleeding in the brain and around the brain, skull fractures, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. I don't know how you say that, but CTE. And it's a progressive neurological disorder associated with symptoms that can include thinking, understanding, communicating, motor disorders, etc. And that usually happens with people who have had multiple blows to the head. So think of boxers, football players, things like that. There can be something called post-traumatic dementia, which I mentioned earlier. And the impact of TBIs is broad and very different. You can get a headache, you can have confusion, lightheadedness, dizziness, blurred vision, ringing in the ears, tiredness or sleepiness, a bad taste in your mouth, a change in your sleep habits, behavior or mood changes, trouble with memory and concentration, attention or thinking, loss of consciousness, sensitivity to light, nausea or vomiting. Those are for the mild TBIs. For moderate to severe, a headache that gets worse or won't go away, loss of vision, repeated vomiting or nausea, slurred speech, convulsions, seizures, inability to wake from sleep, enlargement of your pupil in one or both eyes, numbness, tingling in your arms or legs, clumsy movements, increased confusion, restlessness, agitation, loss of consciousness. So you can see that there are a wide variety of resulting implications from a traumatic brain injury. For me, most of mine were cognitive and executive functioning, meaning my memory, learning new things, my reasoning, my judgment, and my attention were all impacted. So I still, 2 years after my accident, can't remember things. There are entire episodes of my life that I don't remember. People will say something and I'm like, yeah, I have no idea what you're talking about. I know it probably happened, but I don't remember it. I also don't remember the details of a lot of conversations now. I take copious amounts of notes because I may not remember the specifics of something. And it's really frustrating, particularly when you're talking to a dear friend. You know you had a conversation about something important. You know how you felt in that moment, but you may not necessarily remember the details of what they said. I definitely replace words with other words. It's gotten a lot better over 2 years, but there are still times when I accidentally say something different from what I intend. Most of the time I don't even realize I've done it until someone looks at me kind of peculiar, like, what are you saying? And then I realize I've said something that doesn't make sense. I'm very lucky because I have a very robust vocabulary, but every day I find that there are words that I know are precisely what I mean that I can't retrieve from my brain. And I have to find a synonym or describe them. Sometimes if I wait a few seconds, it will come to me, but sometimes it doesn't. I find that I'm more impulsive, and so I have had to be much more cognizant of the fact that I need to stop and think things through because I may make a mistake because I'm acting impulsively. At the beginning, I would get angry very easily. In fact, I wouldn't even process that something had upset me. I would just spark. It's not as bad now, but it does happen sometimes. And quite frankly, it's terrifying because it's as if you don't have control over your brain, because you don't, and something happens and you just react from a hot place instead of processing, oh, that was annoying, and is it even worth reacting to? So it's something that I try to make sure people are aware of, that I give myself lots of rest, because if I don't rest, I find that that is worse. And I try to think through things and remove myself from situations that maybe might agitate me because I don't know how I'm going to respond. I definitely cannot multitask now at all. If I'm writing a note, please don't speak with me because I won't do either well. And I'm not alone in these challenges. What I know is that people with traumatic brain injuries often have the anger issues and changes in their personality. I'm lucky that mine's very mild. I know that the processing speed that I have now is considerably slower. I went to a square dancing lesson with my dad recently, and I noticed that when the caller would say something, it would take several seconds for me to process, which is not good when you're supposed to be doing the move at that moment. So it's something that I'm aware of, and I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to do the square dancing with my dad because, quite frankly, I don't know that I would be able to keep up, that my brain would process the information quickly enough for me to do the move that I'm supposed to. So all of those things have been impacting me and others with traumatic brain injuries for 2 years now. I have gone through 3 rounds of physical therapy. My first was specifically about processing speed. At the very beginning, I took a computerized test to see how I was doing on a cognitive level. And what I learned afterwards, after my physical therapy was completed, was that initially my processing speed, in other words, you say something, how long it takes for me to process what you're saying, decode it, and make sense of it, or things happening in my environment, like when I drive, was 16%. That's 1/6. And it's on a bell curve. So if you think about that, that means that 74% of people were processing information faster than I was. It's very frightening. At the end of that first set of physical therapy sessions, it lasted about 6 weeks, and I was at 64%. So considerably better. Physical therapy can truly make a difference with the healing process. Now, anyone who knows me knows that 64% to me is a D. But it is better than the majority of people, and I do believe that that has improved over time. The other thing that I found, and I continue to work through, is that there was extreme exhaustion. And for more than a year and a half, I had to take a nap every day. In other words, initially, I could maybe, this was a couple months after my accident, work for an hour, meaning read on the computer or read a book or whatever, and then I had to take a nap. And over time, I continued to work on my cognitive abilities and expand that, and it got longer and longer. But regardless, about 2:00 every day, I need a nap. And that's been an adjustment in how I work and what I do. It's been an interesting process because I have always been a type A perfectionist, and I've had to extend grace to myself and others because I've had to ask others, please give me grace, knowing that I have to take breaks, that I reach a limit where I'm no longer valuable for anyone until I rest my brain. And my second round of physical therapy was all about aligning what I was seeing with my eyes versus what my brain and my body was telling me. So for example, my eyes were saying this is center, but my brain and my muscles and everything were saying over here is center. And so I had to do a series of exercises to bring those back together so that they aligned. And that helped considerably with the exhaustion because, as you can imagine, for quite some time, more than a year, my eyes were constantly, and my brain was constantly doing this, trying to compensate for the difference in where I was seeing things versus where my brain was interpreting them to be. Also, I didn't mention this earlier, initially I had extreme vertigo. And I was very lucky because the first physical therapy appointment I went to, they did this movement, this treatment where you are sitting on a bed, like this exam table, and they drop the head down lower and you look over your shoulder and they dip you back and you have to hold perfectly still, and your head is turned and your head is lower than your body, and my eyes were going to like nonstop for several minutes. In fact, the physical therapist kept saying, and you're still going, and you're still going, you're going. And then she flipped me on my other side, and she actually had someone else come in because the fear was that I would fall off the table, because it's a very disorienting experience when everything seems to be moving, but your body is still, but it feels like it's moving. So she flipped me on my other side, so I'm laying on my left side up vertically almost, and luckily my left side was not as bad. And so after that, I asked her, I said, well, how bad was it? And she said, most people wouldn't have been able to walk in here with what you had and would have put it at a 12 out of 10. And she said, most people's eyes go tick, 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 and your eyes were going tick, 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 and went for considerably longer. The only reason I think that I could walk and that I could manage it is that I was a gymnast. And so my body was able to compensate for the disorientation. but it's very disorienting, and I'm extremely grateful that the movement that she did realigned my crystals in my inner ear and the vertigo went away. There are some emotional aspects of TBIs, and I think a lot of it comes from the fact that who you were before and what you could do and the life that you knew before are forever changed. And there has to be an acceptance and hope, because your brain, while it is not going to repair that damage, it will reroute and create new neural pathways, and you will regain some of your former self. But a lot of people with traumatic brain injuries have depression, anxiety, mood swings, they're irritable. Sometimes they have a lack of empathy, they get angry. Sometimes they don't sleep at all, so they have insomnia, or sometimes you sleep a lot like I did. There are other things that are related to it, but those will give you a really good sense of what you can expect in someone who has a TBI, or if you have a TBI. And I say all that because I think it's important for people to understand that if you're with someone who's had a TBI, please be patient and know that if they're reacting in a strong manner, it's not them, it's literally that their brain is damaged and they cannot control it, literally. And know that they're frightened. Because for me, the few times that happened, I was like, wow, that reaction was way more than it needed to be. But it took some time for me to come back down from that anxiety-ridden place and process what had happened. I've been told that it could be 3 years before that goes away. I've also been told it may not. The other thing that happens, and this is really disconcerting for me, is I didn't really swear very much prior to my TBI. And now swear words just come out. Like literally, they just come out. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to say that. I don't process that I'm about to say a swear word. It literally just appears in my mouth. And that's not an ideal thing, obviously. So my advice to you, if you have a TBI, is to be patient and to give yourself grace, to make sure you rest. Your brain is still healing. And people told me this over and over again, it's just going to take time. And as a type A perfectionist, someone tell me it's just going to take time was enormously frustrating, especially because no one could tell me how long or what I could expect or, if I'm going to get better. And here I am 2 years out and I'm still healing, and I probably will continue to heal for another year. And in a year from now, I'll probably know what my benchmark is. I'll never forget the day that my primary care physician, who I've seen for more than a dozen years, and I know well, said to me, Mary Kay, you're probably never going to be the same. That was a gut punch moment of, oh my gosh. I just thought it was like any injury that you get back to where you were before. I remember initially, before I was officially on disability, a counselor who works specifically with TBI patients said to me, what's obvious to me is that you can't work full time. And in fact, it was 2 years before I started working full time again. And that alone has been an adjustment of figuring out, okay, every afternoon I gotta take a break. I take my break. I re-energize and rejuvenate, and then I come back and I finish the things that I need to do. And I'm very grateful that my boss and my boss's boss and my boss's boss's boss all know what's going on and are supportive and understand that I add value. I just need accommodations. And those accommodations are that I take a break when I need to. And it also means that I might work in the evening or early in the morning or on a Saturday. But they know that I'm going to get my job done and that I'm going to do it well. And so they understand that that's just an accommodation, like an accommodation you would make for someone who had another disability, someone who couldn't see or was in a wheelchair or whatever it might be. And I'm grateful. I'm incredibly grateful that I work somewhere that appreciates and understands the challenges that I face and supports me in that work. So that gives you a really good idea about what having a TBI means to me and what it could mean to someone you love. What I want to talk about now is the beauty that has come out of this. You see, I was on this track of being in the executive suite, of having a high-powered job with lots of responsibilities, and I was up at night worrying about things and up early and working all kinds of hours and so stressed. And quite frankly, I was doing work that I didn't like to do necessarily. I was okay at it, but I didn't love it. I sat in the ambulance after my car accident, and it's bright fluorescent lights. They're hooking me up to all these monitors. They're checking my head, and my head was split open from here to here, and it was about this wide. And the force of when my car rolled produced this huge laceration in my head. And in the back of my head, it was so deep that they kept checking to make sure it wasn't my brain, that it wasn't my gray matter. And it wasn't. It was tissue. But it was a very, very deep laceration all the way down to the protective membrane. So I'm sitting there, they're checking my head, they're hooking me up to monitors, they're checking my pupils, they're asking me questions, they're trying to prevent me from going into shock. And I thought, what am I doing? I have continued on this path and done all the things that I'm supposed to do and do all the things that society says is what I should do. And I was unhappy. In fact, I was miserable. And in that moment, I knew that I needed to do what I love, and that's connecting with others and sharing their stories. And I'm incredibly grateful that I have the opportunity to do that. I do that in my full-time job, and I do it with this podcast and inspirational speaking and the book that I have written and that will come out sometime this year. All of those things would never have surfaced had I not stopped. And I stopped because I literally had no choice. My brain was not going to function. It needed time. It needed a lot of rest. And I needed to really stop and prioritize my life. And my hope for you and for everybody out there is that it doesn't take a traumatic event for you to stop and assess your life. For me, it was a really bad car accident. For someone else, it might be a cancer diagnosis, a divorce, a death in the family, a loss of a job. All kinds of different things can cause us to really stop and take stock of our lives. But my goal is for you to do this without having something traumatic happen. If you're not happy, if you don't feel fulfilled, if you don't feel like you can be your authentic self, who you are meant to be, then I encourage you to start finding ways to find joy in your life. I am well aware that you cannot just quit a job without having another job. I'm well aware that where you live and the opportunities that are available to you may not allow you to move into something different. I have been a single mom for 15 years. I live in Charlottesville, which I love this community, but it is small. And the opportunities were very limited. While COVID was horrible, and there were so many negative things about that we are continuing to feel and will feel for generations to come, I also am grateful for the fact that we have realized that remote work is not only doable, but also really successful. I could not work where I am now if I didn't work remotely. And I'm so grateful because I still go into the office once a month. I love my coworkers, and there's very much a part of me that wants to be there more often, but I recognize I can't move to DC, and I don't want to move to the Northern Virginia area. And so as a result of that, I can go up there periodically for meetings and things like that, but I can also have the quality of life and the cost of living where I am. And so that makes a big, big difference. And so COVID taught us that. So what I'm saying is start looking, broaden your horizons, but also find joy in the small things. So I love doing this podcast. I don't get paid for it. It's not anything that's profitable in any way, but I love it. And I truly believe that I make a difference in others' lives. It brings me great, great joy. And I know that someday it is going to have some benefit for me on a financial perspective. I believe that totally and completely, because I know that this is going to have far greater reach, and it's going to impact so many people. And I'm just delighted that that will happen, and that it's happening at a grassroots level now. In fact, Spotify shared with me that I am in the top 30% of podcasts shared internationally. Who knew? I think that's pretty exciting. So I would encourage you to find those little things that bring you joy. It could be going for a walk, petting your pet. For me, it's a dog. Singing, art, writing, reading. It could be building things, woodworking. You get to define what it is that brings you joy. So you find that time, you schedule it into your daily or weekly routine and make it a priority. Make yourself a priority. Also, surround yourself with people who are your squad. Those people who are like you, who encourage you, who are going to say great things about you when you're not in the room. Those people who are going to celebrate and cheer for you when you accomplish great things. We're not in competition with our friends. And if you feel that way, it's not the right person. Because remember, you get to decide who you invite on your island. So if someone sucks you dry, or every time you encounter them, it is negative, extricate them. Don't invite them on your island. You don't need to be mean, but make yourself a priority, because who you surround yourself with is who you become. And the more you fill yourself up, the more you can give to others. The more the people around you bring you joy, the more joy you have and can share. It's like love. It's exponential. If I love someone, it doesn't mean I love someone else any less. In fact, it means my love has grown, and it's like that with joy. So I encourage you to find moments of joy, and I encourage you to be your authentic self. So if you're somewhere where you have to dim your light, where you have to change who you are as a person, boy, that is exhausting. It's demoralizing. It is awful. I have been there, and I was absolutely miserable. I mean, I gained 30 pounds. I cracked a tooth. I had migraines. I had insomnia. I got high blood pressure. I mean, you name it. I had all of the warning signs, because I was somewhere where I was not valued. I was tolerated at best. And now I'm celebrated. And I feel amazing. And that's how you should feel too. So go where you are celebrated, not merely tolerated. Queens of Moxie is all about empowering women to step into joy and live their authentic lives. And that's my lesson for you today. Again, it's National Traumatic Brain Injury Month, and that's why I decided to do this podcast. But it is really about helping you to start your journey to live in that space, to be joyful and authentic. Thanks for joining me today. I hope this has been valuable, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks for joining us on the Queens of Moxie podcast. I hope that you found it inspirational and that it helps you to think about how you can step into joy and live your authentic life. And remember, we have a weekly email so that you don't miss any of these episodes. Plus, it starts your Monday out with an inspirational quote and a beautiful image. If you haven't subscribed yet, go to queensofmoxie.com and click on Weekly Inspiration. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you again next week.